Hi, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my video. In this video I'm going to do a discussion on the concept of Acrasia and explain what Acrasia is, what does it mean to be Acratic, because I'm in probably the next video or the next couple videos I'll be doing an analysis of Plato's Protagoras, and the idea of Acrasia comes up, and I wanted to be able to make sure that the viewers had an understanding of what Acrasia is, what it means to be Acratic, how does it apply to sort of philosophy and understanding. So with that, let's begin. Okay, so this is, what is, so the question is, what is Acrasia? What is Acrasia? What does it mean to say that an individual is an Acratic individual? Well, to begin the discussion on Acrasia, the first thing that we have to do before even describing or defining what it is to talk about human intention, right? And talk about how individuals act, right? And our actions are governed by our intent to do something. So we have to realize that if I were to look at a human being, right, and I were to look at what the human being intended to do, and we'll call this action, well, there's an obvious separation between what I do, the act that I do, and my intent. Right? So I have an intent to do a particular action, and because I have that intent, I do that action. So the example might be, I have the intent, because I'm doing this video explaining Acrasia to you, to grab the Rubik's Cube off of my desk. If that intent is strong enough, then my action will conform to my intention. So I lean forward, I grab my Rubik's Cube, and I say, hey, look, here's the Rubik's Cube, see? The act is a consequence of the intent. Pretty basic. Okay, now, with respect to Acrasia, another layer that we have to recognize is not only the separation between intent and action, but also we have to recognize the role of behavior. So the idea becomes, what is the role of behavior? And this is well before Skinnerian accounts of behaviorism, right? This is, I mean, we're talking antiquity, right? So the question is, what is the role of behavior? Right? So what is the role of behavior? Well, the question is behavior the action? Is behavior, if I attempt to observe what someone is doing, if I attempt to observe what someone does, am I simply, in looking at behavior, am I simply only analyzing the act, right? Is it just the action that I'm interested in analyzing, right? So the question then becomes, is behavior nothing more than an analysis of action? Well, it might seem that that is the case, right? At first glance, you can imagine that someone has a red box in front of an individual and a blue box in front of the individual, and they're prompted and said, grab the box that you feel most comfortable grabbing. Someone might grab the red, someone might grab the blue. Now we might say that in analyzing the behavior, we determined what the act was, right? So that behavior is nothing more than an analysis of action. The problem is, however, if you make the claim that behavior is nothing more than an analysis of action, that you don't see the relationship between action and intent, right? You have to have an intent to commit an action prior to the act, so the argument goes. So, specifically speaking, we'd have to see what is the role of behavior. Well, we can't really have an analysis and understanding of behavior if all we're doing is observing act, right? So that we can observe, we make observations. We say that actions are observable, right? We can observe an act, right? We make an observation of an act. Based on the observation of the action, I can then determine the nature of the behavior. That's one part of it, right? And for those theorists who stop at just the mere observation of action in an attempt to sort of discuss or articulate what behavior is, they lose this other segment, or this very, very important segment of intent and intentionality. The point being is that you cannot have a clear understanding a clear analysis of human behavior without simultaneously having an understanding of both intent and action. So that anytime we're attempting to analyze behavior, we should be looking at both intent and action. Alright? So anytime we're attempting to look at behavior, we can't simply look at behavior as just action, since we recognize that action is a consequence of intentionality. So if we're attempting to discuss behavior or describe human behavior, or talk about classifications of behaviors, types of action, then we have to realize that in discussing behavior, in discussing what it is that human beings are in the process of doing, that we have to look at both the intent and the action. Right? So that's the first part. So it's important to recognize then that in discussing human behavior, we can see that there's a separation between intent and action. We recognize that our actions are observable, but the problem is that our intent is not observable, right? Intent is specific to the individual. Intent is particular. To be technical, our intent is subjective. Our intent is subjective and private. No matter how much I attempt to unravel and get to the source of an individual's action, the thing that motivated the action, the intent to act, no matter how much I attempt to do this, there's always going to be a divorce between me as an outside person and the intent of an individual. Right? This intent is always going to be private. The best that I can hope for in discussing any concept with respect to intentionality, unless obviously I'm talking about my own intent, and this is where it gets complicated, unless of course I'm talking about my own intent, is I can infer intent from action, right? I can say that based on the action, based on what I've observed, it seems as if you had the intent to do X, right? I won't ever really be able to verify that claim, right? That claim that the intent was to do X, obviously is beyond observation. It's beyond verification because it's subjective and private. The best that I can do is attempt to infer intent. However, I can, and this is important that you follow this, I can make an assessment of my own intent, right? I can make an assessment of my own intent. I know for a fact that I want to get the Rubik's Cube. And I know I want to get it, I want to get it, I want to get it, I want to get it. And as time goes by, I recognize that I'm not reaching for the cube, as I did in the last demonstration. And I'm not reaching for the cube. And the question is, did I really have an intent, right? So now that we have an understanding of sort of the relationship between intent and action, and more specifically the relationship between intent and action in a discussion of behavior, we can now have an understanding of what it means to talk about Akrasia. Okay. With respect to Akrasia, what we have is the following. First, some philosophers in sort of general discussion, they'll define Akrasia as a weakness of will. Right? So they'll define Akrasia as a weakness of will. So the question is, well, what is Akrasia? The easy response to the question of what is Akrasia is a weakness of will. What I'll do in this discussion is show you that it's actually far more complicated than just merely describing it as a weakness of will. It's much more complicated than that. But that's a good way to understand, for you to sort of understand the concept of Akrasia, right? What is Akrasia? It's a weakness of will. Well, how does that look? How does a weakness of will look if we were to attempt to visualize this idea? Well, it would look like this. I am the individual, and I have the intent for X, right? And because I have the intent for the X, I have the act, right? So we know that this is the intent, and that this is the action. And the question then becomes, well, let's sort of specify it. Let's make sense.